Just moments ago, the final wall of royal unity completely collapsed in a state of utter disbelief. A statement from Prince William, cold, definitive, and carrying the weight of an absolute ending, has confirmed what the world has dreaded most. The bond with Harry is not just fractured, it is extinct. A final break has been sanctioned after a soul-shattering discovery was unearthed in the darkest, most guarded recesses of the royal archives. The long, hollow silence that has loomed between the brothers has finally been shattered by a reality far more brutal than any tabloid speculation could ever imagine. This announcement arrived like a silent earthquake, ripping through the global news cycle without warning or the usual diplomatic softening from the palace press office. Kensington Palace released a message that froze time, a clinical confirmation cutting through King Charles's Kui Kung, desperate hopes for reconciliation. William stepped forward alone. Catherine was nowhere to be seen, and that solitude spoke louder than any prepared speech. His eyes, usually reflecting the steady, stoic duty of a future king, held only a haunting emptiness and a quiet, simmering grief. Viewers sensed immediately that this was not a tactical PR maneuver, but the personal, public implosion of a big brother who had Kui Kung run out of grace. William's words were sharpened like a blade. He confirmed that this separation is permanent. There is no roadmap for healing, no further concessions, and no turning back. The absence of the usual royal pleasantries or well wishes was the most chilling detail of all. It suggested a betrayal so profound, a discovery so grotesque, that it has effectively erased the shared history of the highboys who once stood side by side against the world. As William spoke, his emotions seemed frozen, suppressed under the immense pressure of months of silent suffering. Keen observers pointed to the signs of profound exhaustion, the rigid posture of a man holding his world together by a single thread. It didn't take an expert to see no. The last tether between Windsor and California has been severed. Across the world, the reaction was seismic. Messages of support collided with waves of anxiety and outrage. Royal watchers sensed this wasn't just another headline. It was a historical turning point, an irrevocable shift in the very image of the monarchy. But what lies beneath this cold finality? Why now? Why did William choose to execute this break so publicly and so ruthlessly? Does this heartbreaking discovery involve the secret files Harry once threatened to expose? Or is it something even devastating, buried within the private journals of a past they both tried to forget? The palace's ironclad control can no longer hide the pressure. This is not a routine update, it is the release of a fury that has been building for decades. One truth is becoming impossible to ignore. This announcement is only the beginning of a much darker revelation. For months, the world wondered what could possibly be the final straw for a brother who had already endured so much public humiliation. But the truth, as it turns out, was far more sinister than a mere disagreement over a book or a television interview. Behind the thick, limestone walls of Windsor, within the climate-controlled silence of the royal archives, a ghost was unearthed. William didn't just find a document, he found a roadmap to his own family's destruction. This was the heartbreaking discovery that changed everything, the moment the future king realized the brother he once protected had become the most dangerous architect of the crown's downfall. The discovery reportedly happened by accident during a routine audit of private correspondences from the late 1992. Among the crates of history, aides found a hidden dossier, a collection of private journals and unsent letters that Harry had allegedly been compiling for years, long before the world ever heard the word Megxit. But it wasn't just the existence of these records that shattered William, it was the content. Sources close to the Prince of Wales suggest these documents revealed a calculated, long-term strategy to dismantle the reputations of senior royals, including his own father and the late Queen, using deeply personal information that only a brother or a son could possess. For William, this was the ultimate betrayal of the bloodline. He had always tried to view Harry's public outbursts as a cry for help, a byproduct of grief and trauma. But holding the physical evidence in his hands changed the narrative entirely. It wasn't a cry for help, it was a blueprint for a coup. The journals allegedly contained notes on private conversations, descriptions of medical vulnerabilities, and psychological profiles of family members intended for future commercial use. The realization hit William like a physical blow. The boy he had walked behind at their mother's funeral had been observing them not as family, but as targets. Inside the palace, the atmosphere turned toxic. William spent nights alone in his study, rereading the evidence, his disbelief turning into a cold, unyielding fury. He began to see every past interaction through a distorted lens. Every hug, every secret shared, every moment of vulnerability now felt like a data-gathering exercise for a lucrative deal. The heartbreaking nature of this discovery lies in the loss of the past. If the future was already gone, William now realized that the past he cherished was a lie as well. As this news began to leak into the upper echelons of the palace, the internal reaction was one of pure terror. If William, the future of the monarchy, was this compromised by his own flesh and blood, how could the institution ever be safe again? This discovery did more than just break a relationship. It paralyzed the internal operations of the firm. William's trust, once a quiet pillar of his strength, has been replaced by a fortress of suspicion. He realized that the greatest threat to the monarchy didn't come from Republicans or protesters, it was coming from the inside. And as the world watches the fallout of this final break, the question remains: how much more is hidden in those archives, and what will happen when the rest of the world finds out? The silence that followed the discovery in the Windsor archives was more than just a lack of sound. It was the death of 1,000 shared memories. For 48 hours, Prince William reportedly said nothing to his staff, his advisors, or even his father. He sat with the weight of Harry's dossiers, the physical proof of a brother's betrayal, until the fury in his veins turned into a cold, clinical resolve. But William knew that before he could announce the final break to the world, he had to look into the digital eyes of the man who had authored his destruction. He initiated what palace insiders are calling the midnight call, a high-security, encrypted video conference that would serve as the final trial of the Duke of Sussex. Those who caught glimpses of William before the call described a man who had aged a decade in a single weekend. There was no room for sentimentality anymore. When the connection to California was finally established, the atmosphere was not one of two brothers arguing over the past, but of a sovereign judge facing a traitor to the institution. William didn't start with an accusation. He started with a question. He asked Harry if there was any part of their childhood that hadn't been documented for future sale. The silence on the other end of the line was the only answer he needed. According to those familiar with the exchange, Harry's reaction was not one of remorse, but of a man who had been caught and was now looking for a way to pivot the narrative. He allegedly attempted to frame the secret dossiers as a form of insurance, a way to protect himself against a system he believed was out to get him. But for William, the insurance excuse was the final insult. It confirmed that Harry no longer viewed them as family, but as adversaries to be managed and leveraged. The conversation didn't last long. There were no raised voices, no shouting matches, only the terrifying, quiet sound of a bridge being burned to the ground. William reportedly told Harry that from this moment forward, he was no longer a brother, a prince, or a confidant. He was a private citizen with no access, no standing, and no future within the gates of the monarchy. The future king made it clear that the discovery in the archives would remain under the highest level of state protection, but its shadow would forever block Harry's path back to London. When Harry tried to interrupt, William did something he had never done before. He simply ended the call. The finality of that click echoed through the corridors of Kensington Palace like a gunshot. The aftermath of that call was the true beginning of the final break. William immediately met with the king's private secretary to begin the formal process of total institutional separation. He demanded that every remaining tie, every ceremonial patronage, and every subtle link to the Sussexes be audited and dismantled. This wasn't just about PR, it was about purging a virus from the system. William realized that to save the monarchy, he had to lose his brother. And as he stood by the window of his study, watching the sun set over London, He knew that the man he just spoke to was a stranger. The boy who walked behind the coffin was gone, replaced by a ghost who lived in a mansion of mirrors. The heartbreak was total, but the resolve was absolute. What happened next was described by palace staff as a clinical deconstruction. Prince William, now acting with the full, albeit reluctant, authority of the crown, initiated what is being called the Great Palace Purge. It wasn't enough to simply end the relationship. William realized that for the monarchy to survive the toxic fallout of Harry's secret archives, the very memory of the Duke of Sussex had to be surgically removed from the institutional body of the firm. This wasn't a tantrum, it was a constitutional survival tactic. Within hours of the final call, the digital and physical architecture of the British monarchy began to shift. On the official royal website, profiles were quietly moved, links were broken, and the narrative was rewritten to focus on working members only. It was the birth of the forgotten prince, a man who was once a heartbeat away from the throne, now being relegated to a footnote in history. But the purge went much deeper than a website update. William ordered a total audit of all military patronages and honorary titles that Harry still held onto as a tether to his former life. Every certificate, every photograph, and every plaque bearing the Sussex name in official buildings was marked for removal. It was a systematic erasure designed to signal to the world that the Sussex brand was no longer just on hiatus, it was dead. Staff were given new protocols. No mentions of the Duke were to be included in daily briefings, and his name was purged from future planning committees for the next decade. William was building a constitutional firewall, a barrier made of silence and paperwork that Harry would be able to penetrate. The true heartbreak of this purge, however, was felt in the private corners of the estate. Sources say William personally oversaw the clearing of Harry's remaining personal belongings from the backrooms of Kensington Palace. Boxes of childhood toys, polo gear, and letters from their mother were reportedly packed and sent to a high-security storage facility, far from the daily sight of the family. This was the moment the reality of the final break became physical. As the boxes were taped shut, so too was the door to a shared childhood. William was not just protecting the crown, he was attempting to cauterize a wound that refused to heal. But as the Duke of Sussex became a ghost within his own family's walls, a new crisis began to brew at the highest level. King Charles, torn between his duty as a monarch and his love as a father, began to falter under the pressure of William's ruthless efficiency. The stage was being set for a clash between the king who wanted to forgive and the prince who was ready to forget. The monarchy had been purged, but at what cost to the soul of the man wearing the crown? The forgotten prince was now gone from the records, but his shadow was about to ignite a fire that even William's firewall could not contain. While William moved with a cold, clinical precision to purge Harry from the official narrative, a different kind of storm was erupting at the heart of power within Clarence House. King Charles, in the fragile dawn of his reign, found himself paralyzed by a dilemma that could redefine his entire legacy. To Charles, Harry was never just a rogue duke. He was the youngest son, the living, breathing memory of Diana that he had tried so desperately to protect. However, the heartbreaking discovery within the secret archives placed the king in an impossible position. Internal sources suggest the king suffered a profound emotional collapse, torn between the supreme duty of the monarchy and the sacred bond of fatherhood. He understood that endorsing William's ruthless strategy meant signing a permanent warrant of exile for his own child, yet shielding Harry risked the total collapse of the dynasty under the weight of the dark secrets now threatening to leak. What made this crisis truly existential was the nature of the discovery itself. The documents unearthed were not mere personal grievances. They were reportedly files concerning a bloodline crisis, historical truths, or genetic information that had been buried for a century to protect the legitimacy of the House of Windsor. Harry, in his desperate search for leverage and financial security in California, had reportedly spent years piecing together a puzzle the palace had spent generations trying to hide. William viewed this as an unforgivable act of treason, a direct assault on the ancestors and the future of the throne. But to Charles, that truth was an open wound, a reminder of the shadows he himself had once tried to escape. The atmosphere inside the palace turned toxic as senior advisors split into two factions, those demanding a total purge alongside William and those pleading for containment to avoid an information explosion that could destroy everything. The confrontation between the two generations of royal leadership reached a breaking point during a private, heated meeting at Highgrove. William, displaying the icy resolve of a future sovereign, told his father point-blank that his compassion had become a fatal security flaw. He argued that a crown cannot be maintained on concessions made to a man who had turned family privacy into a high-value commercial commodity. William's unyielding stance left Charles stunned. He saw in his son the iron-fisted rigidity of Queen Mary or King George monarchs, who were prepared to sacrifice every personal relationship to ensure the stability of the institution. The rift between father and son was now as deep as the rift with Harry. Charles felt isolated in his own home, realizing his reign was being defined by a war he never wanted to fight but could not escape. In the sleepless nights at Clarence House, the king was reportedly found looking through old photo albums, searching for the ghosts of the two boys who once laughed in the fields of Balmoral. But the harsh reality of the archives has erased those memories. Harry appears in the secret files not as a son, but as a clear and present danger to the survival of the regime. The truth about the bloodline and the stolen secrets has turned love into a volatile mixture of fear and suspicion. William has built a constitutional firewall to keep Harry out, but it is Charles who must endure the heat of that fire every single day. His reign, once envisioned as a time of healing and reconciliation, is now teetering on the edge of a symbolic, bloody purge. And as the world watches, a devastating question hangs over the dome of Buckingham Palace. Can a monarchy survive if it must destroy its own children to save the sanctity of the crown? As the news of the final break reached the sun-drenched coast of California, the silence from Montecito was not one of submission, but of tactical preparation. Prince Harry, now fully aware that his brother had unearthed his secret dossiers in the Windsor archives, reportedly realized that the time for subtle negotiation was over. But it wasn't just the dossiers that William had found. It was what Harry held in reserve that truly terrified the palace. Sources close to the Sussexes suggest that Harry possesses what insiders call the stolen letter, a private, handwritten correspondence from Princess Diana that contains a devastating truth about the future of the monarchy and the hidden character of those meant to lead it. This letter, which has never been seen by William or Charles, was Harry's ultimate leverage, and now, with his back against the wall, he was ready to use it as a weapon of last resort. The warning from California was delivered not through a phone call, but through a high-stakes legal representative who made the terms clear. If William continued with the clinical purge of Harry's existence from the monarchy, the Diana letter would be released to the global media. This was no longer a sibling rivalry. It had evolved into a full-scale information war. Harry's message was simple. If the palace was going to erase his past and his titles, he would dismantle their future. The contents of the letter are whispered to involve King Charles's private conduct and a hidden pact made decades ago that would invalidate the carefully constructed public image of the new reign. For Harry, this was a matter of survival. He felt hunted, erased by the brother he once loved, and he believed that only the ghost of their mother could now serve as his shield. The reaction in London to this warning was one of absolute panic. William, who has always positioned himself as the sole protector of his mother's legacy, was reportedly enraged that Harry would weaponize her final words for a public battle. The heartbreaking discovery in the archives had already severed the brotherly bond, but the threat of the Diana letter transformed the rift into a total, scorched earth war. William's advisors urged caution, fearing that a public leak of such a document would be a nuclear event for the monarchy's reputation. However, William's resolve did not flicker. He viewed the threat as proof of exactly why the final break was necessary. He reportedly told his inner circle that the crown would not be held hostage by ghosts or threats from across the Atlantic, regardless of the cost. As the tension between London and California reached a boiling point, the Sussexes' media machine began dropping subtle hints, references to unspoken truths, and the mother's voice, It was a psychological game designed to destabilize the palace. The world was watching a high-stakes chess match where the pieces were made of blood, legacy, and ancient secrets. Harry was no longer just the spare. He was a man who had been pushed to the edge of an abyss, and he was prepared to take the institution with him. The warning was clear. The final break would not be a quiet exit, but a catastrophic explosion. The stage was now set for the ultimate betrayal. As the shadow of Princess Diana returned to haunt the halls of the institution she once called home. While the world watches the escalating war between William and Harry, there is one figure whose silence is more powerful than any official statement. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, has long been regarded as the great peacemaker, the bridge that could eventually reconnect the fractured House of Windsor. But after the heartbreaking discovery in the Windsor archives, the bridge has not just been burned. It has been dismantled by the very woman who built it. To understand the absolute finality of this break, one must understand the Kate factor. Catherine is no longer interested in reconciliation. She has moved from a position of soft diplomacy to one of rigid, protective steel. This shift is perhaps the most devastating blow to Harry's hopes of ever returning to the fold. For if William is the head of this institutional divorce, Catherine is undoubtedly its soul. For years, Catherine reportedly believed that the bond between the brothers was essential for the future of the crown. She was the one who encouraged them to walk together at Prince Philip's funeral, hoping to spark a flame of brotherhood in the ashes of their conflict. But insiders revealed that the dossiers found in the archives changed her perspective forever. The discovery reportedly contained deeply personal observations and psychological profiles, not just of William, but of Catherine herself, and, most unforgivably, of her children. For a mother whose primary focus is the stability and safety of the future king, Prince George, this was an act of cold-blooded betrayal that went far beyond sibling rivalry. Harry hadn't just attacked the monarchy. He had targeted the nursery. This realization transformed the Princess of Wales. The woman who once sought to soothe William's temper and urge forgiveness has now become the primary architect of the silent wall. Catherine has reportedly told her inner circle that trust is a finite resource, and Harry has exhausted his supply. Her silence during William's final break announcement was a tactical choice, a signal to the world and to Harry that there is no longer a back channel, no longer a friendly ear in London. She has retreated into a fortress of motherhood and duty, prioritizing the emotional health of her family over the public image of a united front. The peacemaker has laid down her olive branch and picked up the shield of the enforcer. But Catherine's new stance has created a chilling ripple effect across the institution. By siding so completely with William's clinical purge, she has effectively isolated King Charles in his desire for a more compassionate approach. The palace is now a house of two minds, a king who grieves for his son, and a prince and princess who are preparing to rule a monarchy that has no room for the Duke of Sussex. Catherine's quiet resolve provides William with the moral high ground he needs to execute this constitutional divorce. She has validated his fury, turning it into a structured, institutional policy. As the threat of the Diana letter looms from California, Catherine remains the silent power behind the throne, her eyes fixed on the future, while the man who was once her brother-in-law fades into the shadows of the past. The stage is no longer set for a reunion. It is set for a replacement. The silence from Montecito, California, was never going to last. As Prince William's clinical purge of Harry's royal identity echoed through the halls of Kensington Palace, the reaction from the Duke and Duchess of Sussex was swift, calculated, and designed to destabilize the very foundation of the British monarchy. This was no longer just a family rift. It had evolved into what insiders are calling the War of the Websites, a high-stakes digital battle where history is being edited in real time. For Harry and Meghan, being erased from the official royal narrative was the ultimate declaration of war. Their response was not to plead for re-entry, but to initiate a total rebranding that sought to position them as the alternative monarchy, a global entity that didn't need the limestone walls of Windsor to validate its existence. The California backlash began with a subtle but devastating shift on the Sussex's own digital platforms. Almost immediately after William's announcement, the RQL website was updated with images and messaging that directly challenged the palace's narrative of a forgotten prince. Every photograph was a tactical choice, reminders of Harry's military service, his connection to the late Queen, and his work with the Invictus Games. It was a digital offensive designed to show that while William could delete a profile, he could not delete a legacy. Sources suggest that Meghan Markle, the primary strategist behind this counter-campaign, viewed the palace's purge as a gift. It allowed them to lean fully into their role as the exiled victims of an archaic and cold-hearted institution, a narrative that resonates deeply with a global, younger audience. However, the war of the websites was only the surface. Behind the scenes, the Sussex's media machine reportedly began briefing friendly journalists on the real reason for the final break. They sought to flip the script, suggesting that the heartbreaking discovery in the archives was not a dossier of Harry's betrayal, but rather a collection of evidence showing how the palace had failed to protect them. This psychological warfare was intended to create a vacuum of doubt. Harry's camp began hinting at the existence of a counter-dossier, one that detailed the internal machinery of the palace's PR office and the alleged leaking and planting of stories against Meghan. The message to William was clear: if you erase us from the Book of the Crown, we will write our own book, and the ink will be drawn from the palace's own dark corners. The true intensity of this conflict lies in its global scale. While William focused on the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom, the Sussexes were fighting for the hearts and minds of America and the Commonwealth. This geographical divide has created a fractured monarchy, where two versions of the truth exist on either side of the Atlantic. William's silent wall has met Harry's digital shield. The future king's refusal to engage in a public mudslinging match has inadvertently allowed Harry to dominate the international news cycle. The palace finds itself in a dangerous position. By ignoring Harry, they have given him the freedom to define them. As the digital war rages on, the shadow of the Diana letter remains the ultimate nuclear option. The question is no longer who is right, but who will be left standing when the final server is shut down. The monarchy has survived revolutions and wars, but it has never faced an enemy that knows its passwords. As the digital and psychological war between London and California reaches a state of total saturation, the crisis has finally breached the walls of the private family and entered the cold, unyielding chambers of Westminster. The final break is no longer just a sibling rift. It has become a full-scale constitutional emergency. For Prince William, the heartbreaking discovery in the Windsor archives was the evidence he needed to argue that Harry is no longer just a rogue family member, but a clear and present danger to the stability of the British state. The constitutional fallout is seismic. Legal scholars and parliamentary advisors are reportedly being brought into the palace under the cover of night to discuss a scenario that was once unthinkable: the formal, legal removal of Prince Harry and his descendants from the line of succession. At the center of this storm stands King Charles, a man who is now being forced to make the ultimate sovereign choice. For months, he has tried to balance the heart of a father with the crown of a monarch, but William has made it clear that the time for balance is over. The discovery of the dossiers and the threat of the Diana letter have created a situation where Charles's silence is being interpreted as complicity. In a private, high-stakes meeting that reportedly left the king in tears, William presented his father with a formal document, a draft of a letters patent that would strip Harry of his remaining titles and formally exclude him from any future role in the British state. William's ultimatum was cold and absolute. The monarchy cannot survive a king who protects a traitor over the institution. The pressure from the government is equally relentless. Whispers in Parliament suggest that if the king does not act to secure the integrity of the succession, the state may be forced to intervene. The heartbreaking nature of this choice for Charles cannot be overstated. He is being asked to effectively erase his youngest son from the legal fabric of the United Kingdom. Sources close to the king describe him as a man haunted by the legacy of his own mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who always chose duty over personal desire. But Elizabeth never faced an enemy as intimate as Harry, or an enforcer as determined as William. The king's final choice is not just about Harry, It is about the very definition of the modern monarchy. Is it a family, or is no a cold, survivalist machine? As the king sat at his mahogany desk in Buckingham Palace, the weight of 1,000 years of history seemed to press down on his shoulders. William stood behind him, a silent sentinel of the new era. The document was signed in a state of clinical, agonizing silence. It was the final surrender of the father to the king. The constitutional firewall was now complete. Harry was no longer just a brother in exile. He was a legal ghost, a man without a country or a crown. The fallout of this decision will ripple through the Commonwealth for generations. But for William, no was the only way to save the throne. The king had chosen the crown. The father had died so that the sovereign could live. But as the ink dried, a new and even terrifying question emerged. If the family has been destroyed to save the institution, what is left for the institution to represent? The final act of this tragedy is now inevitable, and the world is not prepared for what comes next. The dust has finally settled over the limestone walls of Windsor, but the landscape of the British monarchy has been altered forever. The final break is no longer a headline or a rumor. It is a cold, historical reality. Prince William's confirmation of the total severance from Harry marks the end of an era that began on a somber day in 1997, when two young boys walked side by side behind their mother's coffin. That image, which once served as the emotional heart of the nation, has been officially laid to rest. The heartbreaking discovery in the archives and the subsequent constitutional purge have ensured that there is no longer a path back for the Duke of Sussex. The brotherhood that was once the monarchy's greatest strength has become its most painful lesson in survival. William has chosen the crown over the bloodline, and in doing so, he has defined the character of his future reign: monolithic, disciplined, and utterly unsentimental. In the aftermath of this decision, the silence from the palace is profound. It is the silence of an institution that has successfully cauterized a wound, but remains scarred by the process. Prince Harry, now a private citizen in all but name, has become a ghost of the institution, a cautionary tale of what happens when the desire for individual truth collides with the inherited duty of a 1,000-year-old machine. The Diana letter and the bloodline crisis remain locked in the shadows, their power neutralized by William's surgical strike. The monarchy has saved itself, but it has done so at the cost of its humanity. For the global audience, especially those who watched these brothers grow from boys to men, the heartbreak is total. We are no longer watching a family. We are watching a state power protecting its own existence. But as the sun sets on the Windsor Brotherhood, a new era is beginning to dawn. Prince William and Catherine now stand as the undisputed architects of the future. They have rewritten the rules of royal engagement, proving that they are willing to make the most agonizing personal sacrifices to ensure the continuity of the throne. The Kate factor has solidified into a position of unyielding strength, ensuring that the next generation of royals, led by Prince George, will grow up in a palace where loyalty to the institution is the only currency. The fire that Harry ignited from California has been contained, but the heat has forged a different kind of king in William, one who will rule with a cold clarity that his father, Charles, never quite mastered. The question that remains for the world is one of legacy. Was this final break a necessary act of protection, or was it a tragic failure of compassion? As we look back at the wreckage of the relationship between the two sons of Diana, one truth becomes undeniable: the crown always wins. It consumes personal lives, it erases inconvenient histories, and it demands absolute devotion. Harry may have his freedom in California, but he has lost his history. William has his history and his future throne, but he has lost his brother. In this high-stakes game of power and secrets, there are no winners, only survivors. The monarchy moves forward, silent and stoic, into an uncertain future. But for the world watching from the outside, the image of those two boys behind the coffin will forever be haunted by the man William has become and the brother he was forced to forget. The story of the Windsor brothers is over. The era of the sovereign has begun.